Hello, everyone. So today I'll be introducing Dr. Tyler. Thank you so much for being here today. Dr. Dennis Tyler is an associate professor of English at Fordham University. Dr. Tyler's academic background includes him receiving his bachelor's from Stanford University, his master's and PhD from UCLA. His research focus includes African American literature and culture from the 19th and 20th century American literature, disability studies, critical race theory, performance studies, as well as pop culture. He has published works in these areas, and his essays and reviews have appeared in the African American Review, Journal of Literary and Cultural Disability Studies, Gender and Space, The Feminist Wire, Oxford Bibliographies, American Literature History, Online Review, and elsewhere. So he's well published. He is also the author of the book, Disabilities of the Color Line, as you can see on the screen. And this was also in New York University Press in 2022 of this year. His work has been recognized with grants and fellowships from the Ford Foundation, Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, Woodrow Wilson Foundation, Social Science Research Council, and the University of Virginia Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and African Studies. So he has taught courses on Oprah's Book Club, African American autography, Black disability studies, Black women novelists, and the First Amendment rights to protest. So as today marks the last day of Black History Month, we're extremely excited to have him with us today and to learn from him. Thank you so much for being here, and please take it away.
Hi, everyone. I'm Professor Tyler. Thank you so much for that kind and generous introduction. And thank you to the NYU Urban Research Seminar and Audrey Traynor in particular for inviting me to this event. I am honored to be here to talk with you all about my book, what I affectionately call my book baby. I've been working on this book for quite some time. As I was writing my acknowledgements, I realized that I've been working on this book in some form or fashion for over a decade. So to be able to hold the book in my hands and talk with you all about the work makes this a very special moment. And I'm filled with immense gratitude and joy at the work being out there. The process of writing the book, however, was sometimes grueling, in large part because a lot of the writing and revising occurred during the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, which is still ongoing and unfolding. As you might imagine, writing a book during a pandemic is a special kind of hell. So for all the folks who had books come out last year, or folks who are writing books right now and they're coming out this year, I just want y'all to know that I feel your pain. But I will say that the pandemic helped clarify for me that the story my book tells is as important to our current historical moment, the time of COVID-19, as it is to the eras of slavery and Jim Crow, two other historical moments that occupy a large portion of the book. So I thought it might be fitting for today's talk to talk about how the color line persists in our current historical moment in the 21st century, as well as speak briefly about the historical understandings of the color line by looking at the work of Frederick Douglass and W.B. Du Bois. I'm planning to talk for about 30 minutes, and I'm hoping that we'll have enough time to talk about my presentation or my book or the article I think you all may have read for your class. The title of my talk is The Problem of the Color Line in the Age of COVID-19. Okay. This is how Black people get killed, said Susan Moore, a Black doctor turned patient who was being treated for COVID-19 at the IU Health North Hospital in Carmel, Indiana. Lying in her hospital bed with an oxygen tube hooked into her nostrils, Moore turned to social media to express her frustration about the poor treatment she received from the hospital staff in November and December 2020. As a physician herself, who understood her own ethical responsibility to protect the health of her patients, she recognized how her care was being compromised at this hospital. While Moore took issue with her patient advocate, as well as her on-call nurse, she described her doctor's behavior as especially egregious. First, her doctor downplayed her condition when she complained of a sharp pain in her neck. Then he wanted to prematurely send her home after only issuing her 2 drug treatments, stating that she did not qualify for more treatment because she did not appear to be out of breath. Finally, when Moore pressed the issue further, her doctor admitted that he felt uncomfortable giving her narcotics, making her feel, as she put it, like she was a drug addict. Only after Moore's STAT-CT scan revealed new pulmonary infiltrates all throughout her neck was she able to receive the care and drug treatment she needed to treat her condition. For Moore, the entire ordeal clarified an ugly and painful truth about the discriminatory treatment Black patients often receive from the medical establishment. So Moore decided to advocate for herself. Despite her breathing being labored, Moore went on Facebook to make everyone aware of what she experienced. And I want to show 2 short clips of her talking about that experience right now while she's in the hospital. If you could go to the next slide or the next 2 slides.
You have to show proof that you have something wrong with you in order for you to get the medicine. I put forward and I maintain if I was white, I wouldn't have to go through that. And that man never came back and apologized. This Dr. Bannock guy.
And could you go to the next slide? At the end, she makes one more comment I want to show.
This is how Black people get killed. When you send them home and they don't know how to fight for themselves. I had to talk to somebody, maybe the media, somebody, to let people know how I'm being treated up in this place.
Thank you. Dr. Moore's experience is a prime example of what the journalist and medical ethicist Harriet A. Washington calls the United States' medical apartheid system. It is a system which has grossly mistreated and frequently withheld care from Black Americans to such an extent that their health profile stands in stark contrast to those of other Americans. Moore's story, in particular, effectively captures the reasons for the health deficit experienced by Black people, who often bear the burden of having to prove their pain, who are accused of misrepresenting their condition or characterized as drug-seeking addicts, and who are typically underdiagnosed or misdiagnosed because practitioners do not take their symptoms seriously. The stress of having to deal with these issues can be overwhelming. Although she advocated for herself and demanded better care, a practice that, according to her son, she has always done given her profession and her history of dealing with sarcoidosis, an inflammatory disease that commonly occurs in the lungs and lymph nodes, Dr. Moore did not win her battle against the coronavirus. Just more than a couple of weeks after she posted her video on Facebook, she died from complications of COVID-19 on Sunday, December 20th, 2020. Dr. Moore was one of many. The disproportionate rate at which Black people are being infected with, hospitalized for, or dying from COVID-19 has been staggering. According to an analysis by the Brookings Institution, the death rate for Black people is 3.6 times that for white people. The Washington Post observed similar disparities, noting that the percentage of Black people dying from the virus is significantly higher than the percentage of the Black population in several states. In Louisiana, Black folks comprise 32% of the state's population, but have made up 70% of the deaths from COVID-19. In Illinois, Black folks are 14% of the state population, but make up 40% of its COVID-19 deaths. In Michigan, a similar phenomenon has been occurring. Black people comprise 14% of the population, but represent roughly 40% of those who have died from COVID-19. These numbers tell an alarming tale of how, to this day, the color line has severely compromised the health of Black Americans, creating racial health disparities that make them vulnerable to a deadly virus. Yet what is also disturbing is how politicians and commentators have been using these statistics to blame Black people for dying of the coronavirus. Next slide. As the historian Ibn X. Kendi observes, to explain the disparities in the mortality rate, too many politicians and commentators are noting that Black people have more underlying medical conditions, but critically, they're not explaining why. Or they blame the choices made by Black people or poverty or obesity, but not racism. Significantly, Kendi acknowledges that African Americans suffer disproportionately from chronic diseases such as hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, lung disease, obesity, and asthma, which make it harder for them to survive COVID-19. But he questions why more politicians and health officials are not attempting to determine which structural barriers make it more likely for Black people to suffer from such chronic diseases. For example, when the host, David Green, asked Republican Senator Bill Cassidy on the NPR's Morning Edition whether Black people's underlying conditions, health conditions, are rooted in years of systemic racism, Cassidy replied, quote, well, that's rhetoric, and it may be. But as a physician, I'm looking at science, unquote. Here is what the science told Senator Cassidy, who is also a US medical physician. Next slide.
Virus likes to hit what is called an ACE2 receptor, an ACE inhibitor, an ACE receptor. Now, if you have diabetes, obesity, hypertension, and diabetes and hypertension are clearly risk factors for problems from COVID, then African Americans are going to have more of those receptors inherent in their having the diabetes, the hypertension, the obesity, and inherent in them having an overrepresentation of that. So there's a physiologic reason which is explaining this.
With all the factors that could explain the racial health disparities of Black folks, including inadequate health care, lack of medical insurance, a scarcity in majority Black communities, or the general racism and exploitation of the medical establishment, Senator Cassidy repeatedly chose to diagnose Black people as having inherent health issues that make them more susceptible to COVID-19, rather than to discuss the precarious conditions set in motion by centuries of governmental neglect, violence, and indifference. This is an all too familiar narrative of the disabilities of the color line, a phrase that captures the historical and ongoing anti-Black systems of division that maim, stigmatize, and traumatize Black people, and represents them as being at fault for conditions they have been made vulnerable to. As I watched the racial pandemic unfold within the viral pandemic and listened to the various commentators discuss the causes of our country's massive health deficit, I realized that the story this book tells is as important to our current historical moment as it is to the 19th and 20th centuries, because it encourages others to reconsider the intersections of Blackness and disability at a time when harmful narratives about racial health are on the rise. My book explores how Black people from the antebellum period to the present have been cast as disabled, as unfit for freedom, incapable of self-governance, or contagious within the national body politic. Such casting has been frequently resisted within the Black literary tradition through metaphorical reversals, where the color line is instead the disability or disorder that demands careful scrutiny. Yet the key contribution of this book lies in an important observation that is overlooked in Black studies and disability studies. Rather than simply engaging in a prevailing narrative of overcoming, in which both disability and disablement are shunned alike, Black authors and activists have consistently avowed disability in varied, complex, and contradictory ways. Sometimes their affirmation of disability serves to clarify their own experience of racial injury, to represent how the bodies, minds, and health of Black people have been made vulnerable to harm and impairment by the state and anti-Black vigilantes. Sometimes their assertion of disability symbolizes a sense of community and commonality that comes not only from a recognition of the shared subjection of Blackness and disability, but also from a willingness to imagine and engender a world distinct from the dominant social order. Theirs, then, could be understood as an expression of interability compassion, a compassion of people with mixed abilities that is rooted in the practice of care and the twin pursuit of racial and disability justice. The color line has a long history, one that began during the period of enslavement and extends to the ongoing police brutality and the health disparities of the COVID-19 pandemic. You could read about the disabilities of the color line in antebellum slave narratives, which reveal how fugitives from slavery were punished with disablement or disfigurement, including amputations, severed hamstrings, or brands on the flesh. You could find them in the testimonies of the formerly enslaved, who detailed how the purported crime of literacy could result in a dismembered forefinger or lacerated back. They are evident in the bodily assaults against Black people who had ventured to cross the color line during Jim Crow. This list included those who moved into spaces marked for whites only, who during interstate travel sat in the first-class train seats that they had purchased, who refused to move to the back of the bus, or who merely took up more space than the law allowed. In the age of color blindness, a period that spans from the 19th century to the present, you can observe the disabilities of the color line in the ongoing racial injuries inflicted on Black people, in particular, anti-Black vigilantism, police brutality, and insufficient health care that often go disregarded due to an ableist performance of disability. Such disabilities can be found in texts that depict all Black bodies, minds, and blood as inherently defective or diseased. They reside in narratives that dispute a Black person's capacity for citizenship, suffrage, or other essential rights. You can locate them almost anywhere Black lives have been despised and oppressed. Almost any place Black lives have been determined not to matter. You need to know only where to search, what to examine, and how to interpret the findings once you dare to look. Next slide. One more. Frederick Douglass, a political abolitionist, author, orator, and the most photographed person in the 19th century, was among the first who dared to describe the color line's continuity between the antebellum and postbellum in terms of its very disabilities. In June 1881, Douglass wrote an account of such continuity in his essay titled The Color Line. He wrote, next slide. Out of the depths of slavery has come this prejudice and this color line. Slavery is indeed gone, but its shadow still lingers over the country and poisons more or less the moral atmosphere of all sections of the Republic. The way Douglass saw it, slavery cast a mulish shadow, for it also poisoned the nation with the prejudicial color line during the initial period of emancipation. Douglass primed his descriptions of color prejudice and the color line with metaphors related to disability and ethics, figuring white Americans as the primary agents of both forms of discrimination. Part of Douglass's goal was to dispel the racist idea that all Black people are inherently disabled. He wanted to highlight how these false narratives about Black folks work to maintain white supremacy and dominion by stigmatizing them as physically unfit, intellectually stunted, and highly contagious. According to Douglass, there was hardly any place in the United States where Black folks could turn without encountering this stigma head on. Douglass declared, in nearly every department of American life, they are confronted by this insidious influence. It fills the air. It meets them at the workshop and factory when they apply for work. It meets them at the church, at the hotel, at the ballot box, and worst of all, it meets them in the jury box. In all of these spaces, the most prized and treasured possessions, the right to health, to work, to worship, to shelter, to vote, and to have a speedy and fair trial were either denied or regulated by the perilous color line. It restricted where Black people could go, how they could move, what they could do, and whom they could mingle with. And its toxicity and pervasiveness produced a suffocating effect. As Douglass observed, the color line reconfigured both space and weather, poisoning the atmosphere and polluting the air that Black folks breathe. To misconstrue Douglass's remarks about the color line as merely a rejection of disability or of disabled people would be a mistake. Such an error would miss how his work and that of other Black writers and activists affirms disability as a part of Black social life. despite how the discourse and production of disability historically have been used against Black people to implement pain and punishment, disdain and discrimination. Douglas's primary aim was to forge an affinity between disability and disablement in Black life, between a condition, injury, or restriction, and between the process by which Black folks are rendered disabled or injured through acts of violence perpetrated by anti-Black regimes. Douglas, who was born in February 1818 and died the same month in 1895, had a particular vantage point of such disabilities across Jim Crow, slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. Throughout the course of his life and career, his view of ability and disability shifted dramatically. While the younger Douglas in 1848 misguidedly thought it was necessary for individuals to prove their capacity for rights, the older Douglas in 1881 reframed disablement as proof of rights denied, owning disability in a way that gestures toward the kind of cross-movement work that could beget liberation. Douglas's writing represents an early example of a public avowal of disability. The important influence of his work, of his take on the color line, however, are often neglected, since most scholars cite W.E.B. Du Bois, not Douglas, in their examinations of the color line. Next slide. In The Souls of Black Folks, Du Bois famously declared, as I'm sure most of you might recall, that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea. While Du Bois's definition of the color line is more global in scope, given its explicit reference to continents other than North America and Europe, he was clearly a student of Douglas, whose words inform various parts of souls, and whose considerations of the color line are evident in Du Bois's description. For Douglas and Du Bois, the color line functions as a metaphorical legal barrier and as a material literal boundary of separation and division. And for both men, the color line is just as informed by disability as it is by race. The words of Douglas and Du Bois have resounded beyond the 19th and 20th centuries. If we listen closely to the commentary of Black activists in the 21st century, we hear echoes of Douglas's and Du Bois's words within their remarks about racism, police brutality, and inequitable access to healthcare and education. Take, for instance, the comments of Reverend Al Sharpton, the civil rights activist and founder of the National Action Network. While delivering a eulogy at George Floyd's memorial service, Sharpton figured racism as a public health crisis. Here's what he said at the memorial.
Reason it got to me is George Floyd's story has been the story of Black folks. Because ever since 401 years ago, the reason we could never be who we wanted and dreamed of being is you kept your knee on our neck. We were smarter than the underfunded schools you put us in, but you had your knee on our neck. We could run corporations and not hustle in the street, but you had your knee on our neck. We had creative skills. We could do whatever anybody else could do, but we couldn't get your knee off our neck. What happened to Floyd happens every day in this country, in education, in health services, and in every area of American life. It's time for us to stand up in George's name and say, get your knee off our necks.
I think it's safe to say that Reverend Al Sharpton had time on this day to think about the relationship between George Floyd and Black people writ large. This section of Sharpton's eulogy earned him a standing ovation. Nearly everyone attending the memorial held at North Central University stood and clapped for him. To drive his point home further, he would later add, quote, "The reason why we are marching all over this world is we were like George. We couldn't breathe," unquote. Sharpton's eulogy captured how Officer Derek Chauvin was filmed kneeling on Floyd's neck for more than 8 minutes, in addition to the disabling and deadly pressure that racism exerts on the lives of Black people writ large. His eulogy recalled not only Eric Garner's and George Floyd's dying declarations, "I can't breathe," but also the suffocation that Black folks experienced due to daily racial violence. And given that Floyd tested positive for COVID-19, Sharpton's references to obstructed breathing and systemic racism would have landed bitterly with Black listeners living during a global pandemic. George Floyd's "I can't breathe" echoed as an utterance of respiratory distress because of police brutality and the coronavirus, dual forces of destruction deadly enough to level his life. But Sharpton's empathetic pronouncement, "We were like George, we couldn't breathe," transforms Floyd's singular plea into a matter of communal and collective Black suffering. Such declarations represent assertions of disability along with calls for mercy and justice. They are powerful reminders of the many ways Black lives are at risk for and on guard against state violence, and they are demands to redress the terror that endangers Black lives. All of this probably resonated with Sharpton's audience. Listening to Sharpton, I also heard resonances of Frederick Douglass, whose words have proven just as relevant to the 21st century as they were in the 19th. Perhaps Douglass, who once boldly proclaimed himself a prophet of Black people, a prophet of Black people, was one indeed. But what I know for sure is that Douglass was a perceptive historian. His uncanny ability to imagine and produce a new world was matched by his unique capacity to remember and reconcile hard-earned lessons from old ones. Douglass's links between the disabilities of the antebellum color line and the postbellum one are significant. Equally important, though, is the way his work both harks back to and foreshadows that of other Black writers, abolitionists, and activists who are explored in this book, including David Walker, Henry Box Brown, William and Ellen Craft, Charles Chestnut, Francis Harper, James Weldon Johnson, Mamie Till Mobley, and Patricia Williams. Douglass's affirmation of disability might strike some listeners as surprising or unexpected, as an unpromising path toward combating the color line, but it is not. This approach is shared by many Black folks aiming for collective liberation and yearning for another place, another time, and another possibility in the present and in the future. Remarkable stories of all the Black authors and activists in my book stand as evidence of the promising work that has engendered racial and disability justice. Work that captures the full complexities of Black life, the times of grief and the times of triumph. The pursuit of racial justice entails, according to the legal and cultural studies scholar Amani Perry, holding the inescapable injustice of racism alongside the immense and defiant joy of Blackness. Next slide. As Perry asserts, the trauma endured by Black Americans is repetitive. We weep, but we are still, even in our most anguished seasons, not reducible to the fact of our grief. Rather, the capacity to access joy is a testament to the grace of living as a protest. The work of disability justice involves affirming this kind of duality too. Next slide. According to Sins Invalid, a performance project on disability and sexuality, disability justice is an honoring of the long-standing legacies of resilience and resistance, which are the inheritance of all of us whose bodies or minds will not conform. Disability justice is a vision and practice of a yet to be, a map that we create with our ancestors and our great-grandchildren onward in the width and depth of our multiplicities and histories, a movement towards a world in which everybody in mind is known as beautiful. Someone might need to mute themselves. This intergenerational dynamic framework effectively captures the work of the Black folks in this book and their desire for liberation and coalition. The ties that bind their stories are the politics of redress, the way they find light through darkness and healing through pain, and ultimately the way they avow the disabled beauty and abundance of Black life. It is a life that, though conditioned and constrained by the color line's long durée, is so precious and so resilient, it cannot be torn asunder. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tyler. Let's give him a hand, please. And for this portion of the seminar, I need to stop sharing, and we have the opportunity for people to ask questions and make comments. So thank you so much for such a thoughtful presentation, and I'll open it up.
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
Thank you for that talk. It was really interesting. And I'm not familiar with disability studies, although I am familiar with race and ethnicity studies. So one question I had was, I used to teach. I was a 6th grade English teacher at a charter school with a lot of low-income Black and brown students. And I know that there's this phenomenon where white students are more, they have greater access to special education services, like extended time on tests and those kinds of things. Or maybe that's not true, I don't know, but that's something I've heard. So I was just wondering if you could relate that to the idea that Black bodies are seen as disabled more often.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Sorry, my screen is being blocked. I can't, is it sweet? Okay. Thank you for that question. I mean, one way that I would probably relate your question to the work I'm doing is by thinking about the ways in which disability is defined in the United States. In part because there's usually an emphasis on the individual when it comes to defining disability, right? Someone who has a bodily condition, and there's less a focus on, say, the system, right? The ways in which certain systemic regimes restrict certain bodies from moving into certain spaces or having access to certain spaces. And one thing I could point to direct you to that is the American with Disabilities Act, right? If you read the language in that law, it will often talk about the ways in which one has to prove that they have a bodily condition that would allow them to qualify for receiving disability services, right? One of the things my book is trying to do is expand the notion of disability, or not even, I'm using a historical definition of disability, one that isn't confined to say what scholars in disability studies are talking about, or even within the law, with the ADA. The American Disability Studies Act, because historically disability has always referred to a condition that an individual has and a system that restricts an individual from getting access to certain things, right? But we often go to the ADA to sort of resolve any claims we might have with disability, but it's futile to do that because that law won't implicate itself. Which is one of the things I talk about in my book. So I'm wondering to think about your question in terms of like schooling, right? And this idea that some students might have more access to services than others, or that white students in particular might have more access to services than Black and brown kids. I'm wondering how much of that hinges on the ADA, the law, and this question of diagnoses, right? Who gets deemed to be disabled, and then how they may benefit from that label or category. I think that might be part of the tension at work. And one of the things my book is trying to unpack and explore. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Also, thank you for a really wonderful talk. I really appreciate that. I have a somewhat unformed question thought that I would love to hear your reaction to. So, you know, Carol Anderson, who wrote White Rage, you know, talks about. I've heard her say that that book is about is not about physical violence, but about bureaucratic violence, and the kind of construction of laws to discriminate against people of color is you know, one kind of manifestation of that. And I wonder if you see a parallel framing of a bureaucratic disability as well. I mean, I, you know, just curious what you have to say, but you know, that another kind of thought that I had about this is kind of concern that the term disability in this kind of conversation, not what you were saying, but you know, in my proposition, is that it kind of intentionally and if it implies a kind of brokenness rather than acknowledging the kind of intentionally constructed nature of racial inequality. Yeah, sorry, that was kind of all over the place, but.
Thank you for that question, Jacob. I think you've given me enough to attempt to answer that. I mean, by bureaucratic, I assume you're talking about sort of structures in place that impede one's mobility. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I certainly see the link between, I guess, the work of Carol Anderson's, at least her take on white rage and what produces it. And then the work I'm trying to do in this book, especially if you think about the article that you all may have read for this course, right? Thinking about Jim Crow's disability, right? There's certainly a way in which I'm trying to lean in on and think about how certain legal cases like Plessy v. Ferguson, where you have white-only spaces or colored spaces, wind up creating not only a system that's about race, but also one that is deeply about disability insofar as it means that certain bodies, Black bodies in this case, do not have access to the white train car. And if they were to try to enter that space, they often would receive some significant physical consequences as a result of that, right? It could be a range of things from verbal abuse to lynching to imprisonment, et cetera. And so there's a way in which, we might think of that as just about discourse or language, but really there are real material consequences at stake for those Black folks who decided to, say, move into the whites only train car, or, even in the civil rights movement, refused to move to the back of the bus, right? That their lives were in danger. In regards to your second question or comment that you were getting at in terms of how there's a risk that focusing on racism as disablement might wind up figuring Black folks or brown folks as broken. I think that's where you're going. I'm not entirely sure, but I also want to point out that there's a difference between the language that I'm pointing out in terms of the racist language that says that Black folks are inherently disabled, and then reframing it, which is what I'm trying to do in this book, or which I've done in this book, to say that there are systems in place that have imposed disability on Black bodies, right? I want you all to hear that difference. And part of it comes up in the talk that I just gave, right? Listening to Senator Cassidy, a US medical physician, talking about the ways in which Black folks are inherently more susceptible to COVID-19 because of some underlying health conditions. I mean, who knows how intentional that language was, but he used the word twice, and it comes up a lot in 19th century, early 20th century discourse around race, that sort of like this need to frame Black folks as inherent or innately deformed or diseased. And so it caught my ear right away. And I was like, now listen, there's a whole other range of ways we could reframe that conversation. And part of what I was trying to do in the talk is think about the years of governmental neglect that would have made Black folks vulnerable to those underlying conditions, which it seems to be a question that no one wants to talk about, which is what the historian Ibram Kendi mentions. The other part of it, though, that I want to just sort of elaborate on because I think this is crucial, is that I do think that there's a line of argument in disability studies that makes it seem as if Black authors and Black activists want to create as much distance between themselves and, say, disabled people as possible for fear that they might get deemed inferior. And part of the work my book is trying to do is dispel that myth. In the reading I've come across, there hasn't been the kind of distancing that some scholars in disability studies and Black studies seem to claim between race and disability. In fact, what I'm trying to point out is that these writers are acknowledging and even avowing disability, right, in their lives by using that language. And so there's something affirming about that. What if we think of this language that's coming up in these texts as an embrace of disability rather than a repudiation of it? I think there's a lot of work there that we can do in terms of thinking about cross-movement work between Black studies and disability studies that up to this point isn't getting the kind of attention that I think it deserves. And that's why the book had to exist in the world, this book. Thank you, Jacob.
Dennis, that last comment, I'm just thinking really hard about it. And like Jacob, my question is kind of unformed, but one of the things that happens in educational research a lot is that we critique the systems that have resulted in disproportionality, for example. So disproportionately more children of color are referred to special ed and then their white peers, or then all races combined, depending on, there's also a big argument about how you measure it. But I think that one of the things that's related to your previous comment has to do with something that I'm questioning my own interpretation of as a white scholar, which is that sometimes that critique most often the critique has come from general education scholars. So people outside of special ed have looked at special ed and said, hey, wait a minute, what's going on? Like, why do we have so many referrals? And what does this mean? And there are scholars whose work I really admire, like Gloria Ladson-Billings is one in particular. And sometimes as a white scholar, what I hear her saying is, let's get away from special ed, and good teaching is good teaching. It's sort of this idea that we need to embrace just being better at teaching. And then when those comments emerge as a special education person who has worked for my entire career with people with disabilities, I get a little nervous about whether or not we're going to acknowledge the existence of a continuum of ability. And I think I have been interpreting those comments as getting away from disability or doing the thing that you're talking about, people talking about doing, but your assertion that they're not really doing. Sorry, that's not very eloquent. But so I'm sitting here thinking about that. And, it's something that I think it's a really complex issue in education because referrals actually start in general education. Special education doesn't participate in the referral process. They participate in service delivery. And so it's really complicated, but I'm just wondering if my own lens has been clouding my way of receiving some of that discussion and critique. And I don't know that you can really tell me that, but I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about the disavowal and like your ideas about how you actually don't see it as disavowal, right? Do I have that part right? And so maybe just elaborate a little bit more would be instructive, I think.
Okay, sure. I mean, your comment does remind me of a case that I at one point was writing about for the conclusion of the book, but I wound up taking it out because I realized that some of the details about it were unresolved and I didn't quite know what to do with that because it was still sort of in flux. So I think maybe it never got off the ground, but there was a case in Compton, I think it was Compton v. LA Unified School District, where some of the lawyers were making the case that because of the racial trauma that many of the students of color had experienced, that they might, that they should be given special considerations, right? And not sort of treated as folks who were in need of punishment, right? But recognize the ways in which the schools had to beef up the care and access that those students received. And I remember the commentary around that case being quite double-edged, right? A lot of this came from when I was watching an episode of the Melissa Harris Perry show back when it was on. Love that show. And she had a whole bunch of guests on there. And one of them was an education specialist whose name I'm forgetting. But anyway, there were some folks who were nervous about that language being applied to Black and Brown students. They feared that it would stigmatize them further. And then there was this other scholar who's making the point, well, actually, it gives us a legal framework, right, to sort of give them access to the resources they need. And I found that explanation refreshing. What is his name? Figueroa? It'll come to me. I found that explanation refreshing, right, because he didn't get caught up in sort of like whether the language might stigmatize students. He was actually concerned about how, at least under our current legal system with the ADA, that thinking about racial trauma in those ways would give those students access to increased services and care, and rather than making them feel punished for their behavior or their experiences in school. And so, there's something there for me, right, that seems to be affirming, right, because you're not creating a distance, you're actually closing the gap. And like I was saying earlier, I think that is that kind of gesture, that kind of cross-movement work is necessary if what we're trying to do is gain liberation for all of us. There can't be these divides between, say, one group versus the other, right? We have to think about the ways in which some of these experiences are shared. And without, giving these kids the resources they need, we may not ever reach that point. But yes, your other point to say more about the disavowal, actually, I think I lost a little bit of that thread, but I'll just say that the writers that I'm talking about are deeply concerned about how their experience of racial injury could be described in these terms. And sometimes it even goes a little bit further to think about sort of like, and to undo this idea that there are certain bodies that have certain abilities that make them superior to other bodies, right? So the example I would give of this, because I used this term interability compassion at some point during my talk, and I'm really referencing the moment in my first chapter that talks about David Walker's appeal. I'm not sure how many of you all are familiar with that text. The third edition was published in 1830. It's a really radical text. And part of the work I'm trying to do in that book is think about both Walker's use of punctuation, but also his typography, right? The way in which certain words are aligned on the page. And he encourages the readers from the very beginning of that book to not just read the work, sort of like to oneself, but to read the work aloud, right? So he's making the claim, like, in order for this work to really have an impact, you have to make sure you have to read the work to others, including those enslaved folks who cannot read, who are illiterate. And part of the reason why I find that gesture so incredible is that not only is he instructing us readers to read the work aloud to those folks who can't read or who have an impairment, another impairment, so they can't comprehend the text, but he's also showing us how to do it, right? If you've ever read that book, or you take a look at the book later, like they're all caps in certain sections, or exclamation points all over the place. There are a lot of italics, stuff that most scholars take for granted, but as someone who's interested in oration and recitation, as like Walker is, those things becoming crucial because they tell you how to read the book, when your voice should elevate, when you should modulate your voice, right? So there's a way in which he's creating a work that is accessible to audiences other than literate audiences, right? And he makes the case that if illiterate readers were to hear that work, they could then interpret the work in their own distinctive way, because he doesn't think of there being this great divide between literate versus illiterate folks. And that was another telling moment for me, because I was like, oh, this is where the mixed abilities part comes in. He's not saying like you should understand the work that literate folks have to do by reading this work aloud as charity. He's actually saying, if you read the work aloud to folks who can't read, then they can then also share the details of the story to others in a way that it's even more compelling than the folks who are literate can. And so he's acknowledging that there are abilities, mixed abilities across with all of us. And that's one way I think he's engaging in what I'm calling interability compassion, right? And certainly it's not a disavowal of disability at all. In fact, it's a way to include as many people as possible into the text and make it as accessible as possible. I would highly encourage y'all to read it. Now, it's risque stuff. Like he holds, he does not mince words when it comes to, attacking white supremacists or attacking someone like Thomas Jefferson, or even, holding Black folks accountable who do not resist white supremacy. But it is a rich and generative text, and one that my students are often surprised by when I tell them it was written. Well, the first edition was written in 1829, the third edition in 1830. It seems like a text before its time.
Thank you so much for that response. There's so much to think about. And also thanks for the recommendation. I think it's, like I said, a lot to think about. I'd like to make sure everybody else who has questions or comments has the opportunity to jump in before we take a break and then come back with the fellows. Would anyone like to jump in?
Yeah, that's okay. Yeah. First of all, thank you so much, Dr. Tyler, for your talk. It's really, really, really interesting. A lot to think about. I'm in the Department of Teaching and Learning, but am studying specifically special education. And so I'm very interested in kind of how race and disability intersect and impact students. And one thing that I'm particularly interested in learning more about is kind of the role that disability identification in schooling and kind of the overrepresentation of students of color, Black students in certain disability categories leads to or contributes to, or there's a link to kind of the school to prison pipeline related to discipline, and specifically the category emotional or behavioral disability is associated with higher rates of exclusion and higher rates of extreme discipline. And that's kind of one of the categories where, where Black students are overrepresented. So I'm curious, kind of if you could speak maybe a little bit to the ways in which our prison system or the school to prison pipeline and the trends we see there kind of maps onto, or how you make sense of that through the lens of your work and of disability studies.
Thank you for that question, Lindsay. That's a very good question. I mean, there is some work in disability studies that thinks about the relationship between the school and prison pipeline. I'm thinking of the work of, I think Nomala Ravellis does a little bit of work around this. Liet Ben Marsh also does quite a bit of work around this. And I'm wondering, I'm wondering, thinking about your question, sort of like how, in terms of mental health services for, I guess, or special learning services for students who are in high school or younger, and how that leads to the school to prison pipeline. I'm wondering how much of that has to do with engaging in a system that is about punishment versus a system that is about care and doing care work, because a lot of the work that I've read about around the school to prison pipeline talks about the ways in which these school settings operate and function almost as if preparation for a prison, right? All the emphasis seems to be on, or most of the emphasis seems to be on punishment, right? Not, for lack of a better word, rehabilitation. And you can see the same kind of language happening in the mass incarceration system, right? What does it mean to focus more of your energy on rehabilitation versus, say, punishment for those who may have committed a crime? And so I think, at least when it comes to mass incarceration, you have all these prison abolitionists who are saying, you know what? We have to abolish prisons, right? We have to imagine a world where prisons are no longer needed. And I often teach about this in my classes. I teach the work of Ruth D. Wilson Gilmore. I'm not sure how many of you all are familiar with her phenomenal work, right? But it's a question I'll pose when we're reading, like, for instance, we'll read, Ernest Gins's A Lesson Before Dying, which is about an innocent Black man who's convicted of a crime he didn't commit, and then he's sentenced to death, to electrocution. And so that fictional work allows us to have a conversation about how Black and brown folks are disproportionately impacted when it comes to the jailing or mass incarceration. And then I ask them to think, like, could you imagine a world where prisons didn't exist? And I usually get a little bit of resistance. It takes some time, right? The prison abolitionist work takes time for people to understand. Most of them can't imagine a world where prisons didn't exist because they make the claim that prisons make us safer, or at least that's the language that's been told to them, right? But in actuality, right, the world is as violent as it's ever been. And we have more prisons now than we've ever had, right? So the logic doesn't match up, right? If prisons make us safer, then why is it that we have more prisons and the world is still violent? And so I just keep pushing them to imagine that world, right? Imagine a world without prisons, which means rethinking how we think about punishment. A similar thing needs to apply to schools, right? Because I can't remember the details, but like I remember there was some incident with a young girl at school who was acting out, for lack of a better word or phrase. And, this is a young girl. I think she was like 6 or 7. And at some point, I think the principal decided to contact either the security at the school or the police. I think it was the police. Because the girl, I think she had flipped over a desk and she was, she was angry about something. So they sent her to the office, put her in the room for hours, and then the police came to haul off this 6-year-old girl, 7-year-old girl, because of her quote unquote bad behavior. And it turns out, I think something at the home was going on. Either she wasn't getting enough food, or one of her relatives that recently died, right? But instead of asking questions about what is going on that might produce that behavior, right? And then figuring out ways to care for her in ways that are adequate, what this school decided to do was to basically send her to prison, or like not prison, but like to call the police in order to correct her bad behavior, but do it through the lens of punishment. And so I think I'm going off. I'm not sure if this is answering your direct question, Lindsay, but the point I'm trying to make is that with the work we have to do in schools is the same work we have to do with the mass incarceration system. We have to imagine a world where punishment isn't the solution to some of the issues that are going on. And that means that's especially true when it comes to students who may be dealing with things at home that they don't have the language to articulate to their teachers or to the principal. But if your only response is a punitive one, you'll never get to the bottom of it.
Thank you so much. Really interesting.
Other questions or comments?
I have a question. I think I have a question. This has been super interesting, and I really appreciate. I would very much like to read your book, Dr. Tyler. It sounds fascinating, and I've appreciated the conversation so far. What's sort of sticking with me is the focus on language throughout your talk, and also seems like in the book, and how important that is. How people hear it, how people receive it. I'm thinking of particularly of children, how they absorb the language that adults use around them. But also, when politicians use words like inherently, like what does that mean? And are people picking up on that? Who is picking up on that because they know what is perhaps subconsciously being messaged to them, and who is completely oblivious to what that might mean? I'm just sort of really interested. I would love to hear your reflections as an English scholar, a scholar of English, right? How that sort of lens informs this work that is touching on so many disciplines. that, I think is relevant to a lot of, so part of our seminar, what's great about it is we are a very interdisciplinary group. And I think a lot of us, your talk and your book probably touches on different aspects of our work. And so I would love to hear you reflect on your experience and your I don't know if you would, identity might be a strong word, but your position as an English scholar, how that sort of frames your work. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you so much for that. Yes, my training is in English in the literature department, and I am quite focused on language and discourse, but I'm also thinking about how discourse applies to our material lives, right? Our lived bodily experiences. So that's where I think the shift happens. But yeah, one of the things I'll point out about the book is that the reason why I started this project is that I was coming across language in the work by Black authors where they would describe their experience of racism in terms of disability. And I kept wondering why that language is coming up. And it shifts depending on who's writing the story, right? If it's a work of nonfiction or fiction or poetry or whatever. But more often than not, the way I've been reading that language, whenever the language of disability or defect or deformity comes up in the work as a way to describe their own experience of racism and racial injury, I've been thinking about how they've been attempting to depict the bodies and minds or depict the experiences of Black people as immobilizing in some instances, and then also how that immobility might lead to either resistance on that person's part, or and that resistance might also lead to sort of physical consequences. The other thing I had to contend with, and this is not directly related to your question, but something I wanted to share with other folks who may be doing this work, is that at some point, because sitting with this stuff is just so heavy, at some point I came across the work of the historian Vincent Harding, who talks about how it's the responsibility of Black scholars to remind themselves in their community that Black folks have survived by finding light through darkness, healing through pain. And part of what I think I'm trying to do the book is heed Harding's call by thinking about how these Black writers and activists in my book engage in a politics of redress that do not dismiss or dismiss disability in ways that that could be seen as creating a distance between themselves and other communities or other people. That piece of information from Vincent Harding, but also you could see it in the work of Amani Perry, who I quoted at the end of the talk, I think is absolutely vital to this discourse, this language, right? That we focus not only on the moments of grief, but also the moments of triumph, that we think about racial justice, as she puts it, trying to contend with the experiences of inescapable racism, alongside with the knowledge that there's an immense and defiant joy about what it means to be Black in the world. Holding those two things together can be quite hard, but it was crucial for me, especially at the very end of the writing process, because the content is so heavy. There's a way in which you can get started on a project like this one, and I've been working on it for quite some time, and get overwhelmed by the language that's being used that is being applied to Black people, and then their various responses or engagement with that language, which sometimes can be hard to parse through. And so part of what I was trying to do is find a through line, right? What are the moments of resistance that comes in? How do they form community in the midst of this violent language? What are the ways in which they resist despite knowing that resistance might cause them bodily harm? But yeah, I appreciate that, because there's a whole sort of like way of thinking about disability that tries to dislodge the importance of metaphor from, say, lived bodily experiences, which is to say that most folks want to only focus on material reality, and they think metaphor has nothing to do with disabled people's lives, right? But that's where the language piece is crucial, right? Because we live in a world where metaphor is everywhere. When I think about even like notions of the body politic. The reason why racism or anti-Blackness is so prevalent and also seductive is because if you frame folks as being diseased or disordered or, or disabled in some way, then it becomes easier for you to exclude them from the body politic, because if they're part of the body politic, then they could cause harm to others. And so people have come up with a whole range of really inventive and violent ways to exclude folks from the body politic. But the body politic is a metaphor, right? And I think we see this playing out even in this current moment with the COVID-19, right? The ways in which some folks are deemed to be part of the group, and some folks are deemed to be not part of the group as threats to the health and safety of the nation. And the way that works is all through language. Thank you for your question, Jocelyn. I appreciate that.